Imagine a man who had already made a fortune selling tractors. He had money, his own factories, and the ability to buy the finest cars of his time. He had no need to prove anything to anyone. And yet, one day, he decided to build his own sports car, a car that would challenge Ferrari itself. At first glance, it looks like a story about personal resentment. But the real history of Lamborghini is far more interesting. Because Ferruccio Lamborghini didn't simply decide to build a car. He entered an industry where powerful names, expensive technologies, and decades of racing heritage already existed. And then the company he created found itself on the edge of financial disaster several times. It changed owners, lost its founder, risked its reputation, and even produced a vehicle that seemed completely insane. And every time it looked as though Lamborghini might disappear, it created a car that made the world talk about the brand even more. But there is one detail we need to begin with. The most famous story about why Lamborghini decided to compete with Ferrari sounds almost perfect. A wealthy Ferrari owner complains to Enzo Ferrari about his car, receives a harsh response, takes offense, and decides to build something better himself. The problem is that the specific details of that confrontation are not confirmed with the same certainty as the events that followed. Perhaps the famous argument became part of a legend that eventually turned into the accepted version of the story. But even if we remove the questionable details about the insult, something much more interesting remains. Ferruccio Lamborghini really did believe there was room for a different kind of Italian sports car. And before we can understand why he thought that, we need to return to an Italy that was forced to rebuild almost its entire economy after the war. Ferruccio was born in 1916, near Ferrara, into a family connected to agriculture. But it wasn't the land that fascinated him most. It was machinery. Engines, mechanisms, mechanical components, and the basic question of how machines worked. He wanted not just to use technology, but to understand why it worked the way it did, and what could be changed to make it better. During the Second World War, that interest became a profession. Lamborghini served as a mechanic and gained experience that would later prove invaluable. When the war ended, Italy found itself in a difficult position. Industry had been damaged, agriculture needed equipment, and huge amounts of military machinery and components were suddenly no longer needed. To many people, those machines were reminders of the war. To Lamborghini, they were raw material for a future business. In 1948, he founded Lamborghini Trattoria. He began producing tractors using available components, engineering solutions, and his own understanding of mechanics. It wasn't a romantic project, and it wasn't an attempt to become famous. It was a calculated business decision. Post-war Italy needed tractors. Ferruccio knew how to build them, and the business began to grow. As the business grew, so did his fortune. Later, he expanded into heating and air conditioning systems, and by the beginning of the 1960s, he had become a wealthy industrialist. And this is where the paradox begins. The man who had made his money from agricultural machinery started buying expensive sports cars. But for Lamborghini, they weren't just toys. He studied them like an engineer. He looked at how the cars were constructed, how the clutch worked, how the engine responded under load, and how comfortable the car was in everyday driving. And among the cars in his garage was a Ferrari. This is where the legend begins. According to the popular version, Ferruccio was unhappy with the clutch of his Ferrari and decided to discuss the problem with Enzo Ferrari. After a heated exchange, he supposedly decided to build his own car. The story is so cinematic that it's almost impossible not to remember it. But if we remove the uncertain details about the insult, something else remains. Lamborghini genuinely believed that an expensive sports car could be made differently. To him, faster did not automatically mean better. A car should combine high performance with comfort, quality, and everyday usability. Ferrari had an enormous racing heritage. Lamborghini wanted to offer a different character. Not simply a racing car adapted for the road, but a new kind of grand tourer. But now Ferruccio faced a problem. A dream was one thing, and an automotive company was something completely different. He needed engineers, an engine, production facilities, and people capable of turning money into a real product. And that is when the boldest experiment in the young company's history began. In 1963, Automobili Lamborghini was officially established in Sant'Agata Bolognese, and almost immediately it became clear that Ferruccio was not planning to take the cautious route. Instead of starting with a simple car using an existing powertrain, he commissioned engineer Giotto Bizzarini to create a new V12. This was an extremely ambitious engine for a company that had only just appeared. Lamborghini had no decades of sports car production behind it, no established racing infrastructure in this field, and no guarantee that customers would buy its cars at all. But the future legend began exactly this way, with a decision to take a risk. Bizzarini developed a 3.5-liter V12 with an architecture designed around high performance. For Lamborghini, this was more than an engine. It was a statement of intent. The company was telling the market, "We are not here just to put a beautiful badge on another car." In 1963, the 350 GTV appeared at the Turin Motor Show, a prototype intended to prove that Lamborghini was a real automotive company. But building hundreds of cars that could start every morning, drive on ordinary roads, and return from the dealership without falling apart was a completely different challenge. So the engineers began changing the project. Paolo Stanzani adapted the engine for more comfortable road use. The body was refined. And in 1964, at the Geneva Motor Show, the 350 GT appeared, the first production Lamborghini. Now the company was no longer just an ambitious idea. It had customers, production, and its own V12. But the most important developments were already happening behind the scenes. Because the young engineers at Lamborghini did not want to simply build a good GT, they wanted to test an idea that could change the entire market. The idea was risky. The engine could be placed behind the passenger compartment. The layout was already known in racing, but applying it to a luxury road car was far more complicated. There were problems of cooling, weight distribution, packaging, body structure, and everyday usability. In other words, Lamborghini's engineers were preparing to abandon the familiar logic of the front-engine GT. And in 1965, they arrived at the Turin Motor Show, not with a beautiful finished body, but with a bare chassis. 1 year later, in 1966, the Miura appeared in Geneva. And this is where Lamborghini's story stops being simply the story of a young manufacturer. It becomes the story of a revolution. Marcello Gandini created the design for Bertone. The body was low, wide, and almost unbelievable in its proportions. But the most important feature was what sat behind the cabin: the engine, mounted transversely. Today, that architecture seems almost natural for a supercar. Back then, it was far from standard, especially for a luxurious road car. Lamborghini had not simply built a fast car, it had changed the architecture of the automobile itself. The Miura looked as if it had been created not for the ordinary road, but for the future. And this was where the image of Lamborghini that would last for decades was born, an engineering solution transformed into emotion. But the success of the Miura had a darker side. The louder Lamborghini's name became, the more resources the company needed. The public saw only the gleaming exterior. Inside the business, things were becoming far more difficult. And then Lamborghini placed another bet on a car that would permanently change its image. In 1971, at the Geneva Motor Show, the company presented the Countach LP500 prototype. This was no longer simply a beautiful car, it was a statement. A wedge-shaped silhouette, sharp lines, an incredibly low stance. The car looked almost unreal. Marcello Gandini once again played a central role in creating the Lamborghini image, while Paolo Stanzani worked on the engineering. Even the name captured the emotion. Countach was a Piedmontese exclamation of astonishment, and the car was designed to provoke exactly that reaction. But the LP500 never entered production in its original form. The structure had to be redesigned, and in 1974, the Countach LP400 appeared. And here something important happened. The Miura revolutionized the architecture of the supercar. The Countach revolutionized its appearance. Lamborghini was no longer selling speed alone. It was selling a silhouette that could be recognized from a distance, a car poster, the kind of machine a teenager could put on a bedroom wall without ever having sat in a real one. And that was the moment Lamborghini began transforming from a car manufacturer into a manufacturer of dreams. But while the entire world was staring at the Countach, the company was facing a problem that could not be seen on the poster: money. The automotive business required enormous investment. In 1972, Ferruccio Lamborghini sold 51% of the company to Georges-Henri Rossetti. His control weakened, and soon it disappeared altogether. In 1974, Ferruccio left the automotive business completely. The man who had created Lamborghini no longer controlled the company he had built. And this is where one of the most dramatic chapters of the story begins. Lamborghini already knew how to create cars that became symbols. Now it had to prove that it could survive without its founder. The following years became almost a fight for survival. Owners changed. Financial problems appeared. The company had to search for new ways to remain alive. In the 1980s, Lamborghini was acquired by the Mimran brothers. New funding arrived, and new projects emerged, including the Jalpa. But the real test was still ahead, because Lamborghini decided to build a car that seemed completely incompatible with its own identity. In 1986, the LM002 appeared, a huge, heavy, powerful off-road vehicle with a V12. Look at it from the outside. A company known for the Miura and Countach suddenly builds a massive SUV. If you think of Lamborghini only as a supercar brand, the decision looks insane. But this same willingness to break its own rules appears again and again throughout its history. Lamborghini did not ask, "What does a sports car company usually do?" It asked, "What can we do if we're willing to go against expectations?" The LM002 was not an ordinary commercial success, but it demonstrated the brand's character. Then the story changed again. In 1987, Lamborghini came under Chrysler's control. The company gained new resources. In 1990, the Diablo arrived, a new V12 flagship. And once again, Lamborghini had a car that became a symbol. But the success of a single model could not solve the fundamental problem. The company was still under pressure. In 1994, Chrysler sold Lamborghini to the Indonesian investment group Megatech. Another owner, another chance, another period of uncertainty. And by this point, the story was beginning to look almost paradoxical. Lamborghini had already proved several times that it could create incredible cars. So why was it still so difficult for the company to remain stable? This is one of the most important lessons in its history. Being a legendary car brand and being a financially successful automotive business are not the same thing. You can build a dream car and still end up on the edge of collapse. Lamborghini experienced that reality more than once. And then, At the end of the 1990s, a buyer appeared who changed the future of the company. In 1998, Lamborghini entered the Audi-Volkswagen group. At first glance, this could have looked like the end of the old Lamborghini. A small Italian company was now part of a huge German automotive group. And an obvious question emerged. What would happen to the brand's character? Would Lamborghini become just another product of a giant corporation? But something unexpected happened. Lamborghini gained what it had so often lacked: financial stability, technology, production resources, and the ability to plan for the long term. Now the challenge was different. The question was no longer how to survive. It was how to grow without losing the identity that made Lamborghini special. The first symbol of this new era was the Murcielago, introduced in 2001. A new V12, new technology, a new level of production. But it was still recognizably Lamborghini. And then the company took a step that proved even more important. In 2003, the Gallardo appeared. If the Murcielago represented a continuation of the traditional V12 line, the Gallardo was meant to expand the audience itself. A V10, more compact dimensions, a more accessible position within the model range. And that is precisely why the Gallardo became one of the most important cars in the company's history. Lamborghini was no longer a manufacturer producing rare V12s for an extremely small circle of buyers. It was becoming a global brand. More cars, more markets, more customers. Then came the Aventador in 2011. A naturally aspirated V12, a new carbon fiber monocoque, modern technology. But the concept remained recognizable: a massive flagship engine, aggressive design, and the feeling that the car existed right on the edge of what seemed reasonable. In 2014, the Huracan arrived as the successor to the Gallardo. It continued the V10 line and strengthened Lamborghini's position around the world. But the biggest test was still to come. Because Lamborghini was about to do something that seemed almost impossible for a brand like this. It was going to build an SUV. In 2018, the Urus appeared, Lamborghini's first production super SUV. And suddenly the story seemed to return to its very beginning. How could a company born from tractors, transformed by the Miura and Countach, survived Chrysler and Megatech, and built legendary V12s now sell a large, practical vehicle? To some enthusiasts, it looked like a betrayal. To the company, it looked like an enormous opportunity. The Urus allowed Lamborghini to enter a much broader segment of the market and dramatically increase the scale of its business. And here we find an irony that almost sounds too perfect to be invented. Ferruccio Lamborghini had once built his fortune selling machines to people who needed working equipment. Decades later, his name became synonymous with supercars. And then the brand once again began selling a vehicle that was not a pure two-seat supercar. Of course, it belonged to a completely different era and a completely different market. Yet the same principle could still be seen. Technology should have character, but it should also serve real life. Perhaps that flexibility is exactly what allowed Lamborghini to survive into the modern era. And this is where the bigger picture becomes clear. Lamborghini never evolved in a straight line. Again and again, it faced the same choice: become safer or take a risk. Ferruccio began with tractors. Then he entered the automotive business. The company took a chance on its own V12. The engineers took a chance on a mid-engine layout. Then came the Miura. After that came the Countach. Then the company lost its founder and nearly lost its financial stability. It changed owners. It built the LM002. It survived Chrysler. It survived Megatech. And only after Audi arrived did it gain the ability to build a long-term strategy. Even then, The risk did not disappear. The Gallardo expanded the audience. The Urus divided enthusiasts. But every time, Lamborghini did the same thing. It took a decision that could change its future and turned it into part of the brand's identity. And that is the real secret of its history. Lamborghini never defeated Ferrari in one great battle. It did not destroy its rivals. It did not become the best at everything. It did something else. It created its own category of emotion. Ferrari could be associated with racing heritage. Lamborghini created its own language. The V12 became part of its character. The mid-engine layout became a symbol of the Miura. Sharp lines became the visual language of the Countach. Even the upward opening doors became part of an entire generation's visual memory. A person might not know exactly which Lamborghini they are looking at, but they often recognize the brand from the silhouette alone. And that achievement happened long before social media, viral videos, or modern marketing algorithms. The brand created such a powerful image that it survived multiple owners, financial crises, and generations of cars. But there is another paradox. Today, it can seem as though Lamborghini was always destined to succeed, as though a brand like this simply had to appear. But in 1963, nothing was inevitable. There was a small new company in Sant'Agata Bolognese. There was an industrialist who had made his fortune building tractors. There were engineers who were given the freedom to take risks. And there was Ferrari, a company with an enormous reputation and an established name. Lamborghini could have remained an interesting but short-lived chapter in automotive history. It could have failed during its financial crises. It could have disappeared after another change of ownership. Its character could have been lost under the control of a giant corporation. But none of that happened. And perhaps that is exactly why its story still works so well, because this is not a story about perfect success. It is a story about survival, about a company repeatedly standing at a crossroads, become safer, or remain true to itself. And almost every time, its most memorable decisions came when it refused to play it safe. The Miura was risky. The Countach was risky. The LM002 was risky. Working with a giant corporate group could have destroyed the brand's identity. The Urus could have angered its fans. But those decisions also expanded Lamborghini's boundaries. That is the Lamborghini paradox. It was never simply a company that built very fast cars. It became a company that knew how to turn engineering into emotion. And that is much harder than simply building a powerful engine. You can create a car that accelerates faster. You can add more technology. You can make the body lighter. But to make a person stop, turn around, and keep remembering that car 20 years later, you need something else. You need character. Ferruccio Lamborghini did not begin this journey with a dream of fame. He began with mechanics. Then came tractors, then money, then Ferrari, then the idea of building a car his own way. And after that came a company that could have disappeared several times, but each time returned with another car and another challenge to the market. Ferruccio never created the Gallardo, Murcielago, Aventador, Huracan, or Urus. He never saw the Lamborghini of the modern era. But his original decision to do things his own way became the foundation on which all of it was built. And if a low, wide, angular car appears around a corner today, with a silhouette that cannot be mistaken for an ordinary machine, what we are seeing is not simply another supercar. We are seeing the consequences of a decision made by a man who once had enough with tractors. Perhaps that is why the most accurate sentence about Lamborghini is a very simple one. It was never enough for the company to be like everyone else. That is why it went from tractors to the Miura, from the Miura to the Countach, from the Countach to the Diablo, from the Diablo to the Murcielago, from the Gallardo to the Aventador and Huracan, and then to the Urus. Owners changed, engineers changed, technologies changed, entire eras changed. But one idea remained the same. Lamborghini had to be different, and perhaps that is the reason the company can still be recognized before you even see the badge. Because Ferruccio Lamborghini once decided to build a car his own way, and then the whole world wanted to see what would happen.